Welcome. Hi, it's Rayna Neises, your host with the Season of Caring podcast, where we share stories of hope for family caregivers, breaking through the busyness and loneliness of caregiving to see God in every season of life. I'm excited to introduce you today to Debra Hallisey. Debra is a past caregiver who lost her job due to caregiving. As a result, she founded her company, Advocate for Mom and Dad. Deb writes on caregiving issues for adult children of aging parents at her website, www.advocateformomanddad.com. She's an author of 2 books, Your Caregiver Relationship Contract, a practical step-by-step guide discussing relationship issues that arise between caregivers and their partners, and a relationship contract for dementia caregivers, which provides the readers with practical knowledge and necessary steps at each stage of the disease to continuously adapt their practices and expectations to meet the needs of the person you care for, and more importantly, your own needs as the disease progresses. Deb, it's so good to have you here today. I'm excited to be able to visit with you.
Rayna, it's a delight to be with you as always. I thoroughly enjoy when we get to catch up with one another.
I like to start off by just sharing a little bit about your mom and dad and your caregiving season. So share with us what that was like.
So my caregiving season lasted for 9 years, I want to say, 8 or 9, somewhere in there. I have to do the math. It started in 2014 when my dad was diagnosed with congestive heart failure. And I became his caregiver, going to doctor's appointments with him, and didn't think about the fact that I was a caregiver. But maybe even more importantly, because Dad was my mother's caregiver, who was legally blind and had mobility issues and a diabetic, I really started to help him with her. We lost him in 2015, and that's when I became my mother's caregiver. My mom and we were able to keep her in her home for 7 years. And then the pandemic did me in. She had 2 wounds we had to take care of. She had an eye infection where she lost the rest of her eyesight. And my health started to really take a toll. And after 7 years, one day I was able to say, Mom, we have to change something. I'm having health problems. And God bless my mother. Her immediate response is, your health is not worth me staying in this house. And so she agreed to a move to an assisted living, which is about 10 minutes from me. And I lost her last November, completely unexpectedly, peacefully. I got a call from the assisted living saying, we can't believe we have to tell you, your mom died.
Wow.
But I do have to tell you that it came at the end of an incredible month together, a joy-filled month together. And I think she was truly at peace, and she just let go, and God came and took her. In fact, maybe at the end, I'll read you something my brother wrote to me, which was incredible. He sent it to me in a text a couple of days after we buried her. So that's why I say I'm now a past caregiver, even though that feels really weird after having been a caregiver for so long.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's where seasons come from, right? For me, I think there are seasons of those caregiving. And one of the things that I have a person who helps me with a support group that I lead, and she said, I went from a caregiving season of caring for a daughter who was born with special needs, and she passed at 30 years old. And she also lost her husband really close to that same period of time from Crohn's. And she said, I went from being their caregivers to learning how to be my caregiver. And I think as a caregiver, that is such an important thing to learn, is how do I care for myself? And we have to do it in the middle of our season of caring for others, but we also have to do it when we lose them, because life changes so much. And it does take a period of really adjusting and learning how to take care of ourselves.
100%, 110%, Rayna. It's so interesting to me because there's a couple of things going through my mind. I mean, I came across a term called grief relief, and I definitely not only felt that when my mom passed, but I also actually felt that when I moved her into the assisted living. There was such grief around taking her out of our family home, and I felt so bad about that. But at the same time, there was such a relief that I was not 100% responsible any for. And then I felt guilty for the relief,
Mm.
and I think when you've been intensely caregiving and an intense caregiving situation doesn't have to last for years. It could be months with somebody getting a
Mm-hmm.
diagnosis that they go very quickly, but it's crisis after crisis. And one of the things that I've come to realize is I'm still in that fight, flight, or fear mode,
Mm-hmm.
100%.
Mm-hmm.
And I expected that to go away, and it didn't. And so part of taking care of myself is giving myself grace because I don't have the energy
Mm-hmm.
that I feel like I should.
Mm-hmm.
I don't socialize and go out with people. I thought, oh, now I have the time to go out and meet friends.
Yes. Yes.
Sometimes I do, and sometimes I don't,
Mm.
and we can beat ourselves up for not getting back to normal,
Yes,
but normal is gone. We
it
have to create a
is.
new normal.
100%. I've been doing some research on grief just because so many people I've been talking to about it and the impact both while we're caregiving and then that after time. And that after caregiving, one of the things that I loved when I found the research that was talking about our brain is having to completely rewire. Because as caregivers, like you said, we've always been looking at all of life, all of our decisions. Can I go do this? Can I afford to do that? Do I have the time and energy to do that through the lens of caregiving? This person has been dependent on me. So every decision I make goes down that path that considers that responsibility. Just like a parent, many other things in life, we have those lenses we have to look at life through. Now, suddenly that lens is gone, and the ruts, the actual processing pathways in our brain no longer have to go there. But they naturally do because they have for so long. So we're having to rewire our brain and recreate those thought patterns without that person and that responsibility in them. And it's exhausting. It's exhausting to completely learn new things always, but definitely in the midst of that's part of what makes grief so difficult is this relearning what it's like in this next season of life.
It's so interesting you said that. I called friends that are out on the West Coast to say Happy Easter to them. And they're like, we would like you to come along with us to a 2-week cruise in Alaska in August of 2024. And my initial thought is, oh, I can't plan that far ahead. And then I was like, no, actually, you can.
And yeah.
You can. And it was just this weird, like I almost couldn't connect that in my head.
Mm-hmm.
And I went like, oh, yeah, no, I would love to, and that's really exciting to think that I can do that. Now, I know things can happen between now and then.
Sure.
But the possibility
is there now. Yeah.
Is there now, and it's disorienting.
It is. Yeah. Because for so long, that wasn't your normal. So it's taking time to establish what the new normal looks like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's funny you should say rewiring your brain, because that's this week's blog post is about that fight, flight, or fear. And I'm in kind of the fear where it's like you suddenly put the brakes on, right? Mm-hmm. And, and what comes out of that is just what I'm feeling is lethargy, I'm not quite the bubbly personality I was, and just all these things. But what really struck me about that was we don't realize as caregivers the trauma we have during that process. Mm-hmm. And trauma is the right word. Mm-hmm. It just is. And trauma imprints on your memory and the hippocampus.
Yep.
And you actually have to, as you said, rewire that. Mm-hmm. And you know what? It can take years.
Mm-hmm. It does, definitely.
And nobody tells us that.
No. And it's funny because I think for myself, I kind of fooled myself into thinking I was grieving. Not that I wasn't. I really was grieving. I mean, I had a 14-year journey with my dad. So there was grief. There was a lot of grief throughout it of him forgetting who I was, just all of those things. But when he was gone, I really didn't think that the grief would be so deep and so long. because it was a long goodbye. But man, it was. And it surprised me. It really did. That's part of the reason why I know how hard it is when you lose. I think the second parent, the last parent, is also very different, but there's just a long, exhausting process. And when you realize how much work your brain is doing to just adapt to what life is now compared to what it was before, like you said, getting your cortisol levels down, just all of the things. There's so much that's happening that it really is a long process. And giving yourself the grace and the time, those are the two things that I would tell people over and over again. It's just be gracious with yourself, let go of the expectations, because it's not going to be anything like you think it will be. And to just be kind to yourself through the journey. Allow yourself the space, the rest. I slept a lot. It was months before I didn't nap every day. And that just is not me. It hadn't been me and isn't me today. So, but it was in that season. And I say that frequently. It's a season of grief. We leave that season of caregiving, but we enter into a season of grief, and we don't expect it. And we don't think that that's normal or that it should happen or it should be this bad. But I think that's true probably of a season of caregiving too, right? So it's just one more thing.
Yeah. I think what's so interesting is, and you've said it, that I always say grief runs through caregiving like a river. We may not recognize that it's grief. It may come out as anger or frustration or depression, but it really does underlie it. And we really need to claim it, because if we don't claim it, we can't move beyond it. And it comes out as all those other emotions. Mm-hmm. But the part that I find frustrating is society makes it okay to grieve after a death.
Yes.
So that whole grief during the process, no one really lets us talk about it unless you're another caregiver and you can. And then once the death happens, you're like, well, why aren't you over this? It's been 5 months. Mm-hmm. They don't realize that a caregiving situation is so intense that intensifies the grief. So I'm curious, when you lost your mom, did that reignite feelings of grief for your dad?
So I lost my mom first.
Okay, you lost your mom first.
Yes.
Okay.
So I lost my mom first. I was 28 when my mom passed away.
Okay.
And sadly, when I look back on that experience, my life was in crisis in a lot of ways. Financially, my marriage was not good at that point. And then my mom's death was very traumatic, as I think most are, but she screamed in a looping cycle for 6 weeks. And so it was a very long, drawn out process. And there really wasn't much they could do to give her relief. And so I was very young, and that was the first death that I had experienced. And it was awful. And I was in a position where I didn't have space. I didn't give myself space. We had her funeral and I was back at work the next day. I was working 3 jobs. And so I would say I had delayed grief. I didn't really grieve. Now throughout, because it's been a long time that she's been gone, then throughout life, as moments have happened that I wish she was there, I've grieved her not being there. And I've had smaller moments of grief. But then losing my dad, I think, did trigger more of that grief of not having my mom, because I didn't necessarily take the time and allow the space. I think it is interesting. I don't know if it's because we're older that we have more space or why it is, but I think when we're younger or when we're in a certain season of life, that's where I think people's expectations that you just move on comes in, because life goes on. And when you're in a point in life where I just didn't have a choice not to go on with my mom. And so I did. And I think I eventually, smaller periods of time, grieved it. But I would definitely say losing my dad too brought it to a whole different level. And I do think, and maybe I just contributed that to being both parents being gone, but I felt like losing my dad was I call it an untethering experience. I felt like my place that I always was grounded and could always come back to, that love and acceptance and person who looked at me through lens of never do wrong. It was gone. And it was very unsettling to have my dad gone. But that was who that person was for me. So I'm not
Yeah.
sure.
Well, it's interesting because in retrospect, because we lost my dad and I immediately became my mom's caregiver,
Mhm.
I didn't really get a chance to grieve him either.
Yeah.
There were things that happened, and I think we've talked about this, where I walked into a Hallmark store a couple of months later and started sobbing and had to walk out, right? Because it's like,
Mhm.
oh my God, I'll never buy him another card.
Mhm.
But when I lost my mom, it really did bring up the grief for him again. And I think partially because they were so tightly a couple.
Mhm.
But the other thing that's so interesting, I'm now 5 months out, and I find myself even more than when she was first gone thinking, oh, if she was here, the dog got groomed and she loved when he first got groomed. And I was like, oh, I would have brought him right over so she could see him because he smelled so good and she loved him. I find myself having those kind of thoughts,
Mhm.
less than when it first happened. And maybe because there's a lot of stuff that has to go on. But
Yes.
I've talked to other people who have said, yeah, it takes about 5 or 6 months before it's like, oh no, they really are gone.
Mhm.
It's like you don't deny it in words, but in your head, it's not real yet.
Yes. Yeah, it's this head and the heart thing that aren't connected
Yeah.
anymore. At this point, there's this dissonance between the two, that the heart is still longing to be with them and the head's going, oh, that's right. It's trying to catch up. The heart
Yeah.
is not where the head is. The head realizes they're gone. But I would say it goes on for a long time. I mean, I think that's part of going through those first holidays without them. That feels
Yeah.
awkward. But the second holiday without them is like, oh, yeah, they're like really gone.
Yeah, I found that with my dad. I think the first holidays I was so focused on getting my mother through it
Yes.
that I didn't think about it at all. But that second holiday I found even harder. And she was better.
Mhm.
So it's interesting. I'm trying to think. I was going to be Mother's Day. Last year, my brother and sister-in-law sent us out for brunch. We had a wonderful day. What are you going to do?
Mhm.
Right? I want to mark it in some way. So what are you going to do? How are you going to get through this? And I haven't decided yet.
Yeah.
I haven't decided yet.
I think new traditions are important in thinking about and really being able to honor it and not just let it go by as if it's not happening, but really be able to honor. And you do get to a point where I feel like the memories become really sweet. And
Mhm.
just those moments of reminiscing can be a real blessing to really just take the time to honor and think about what that relationship was and all that it brought to your life.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's really weird. This is so silly. The thought's so silly. But so my mother prayed to Saint Teresa of the Little Flower. Having grown up Catholic, I get that, right? And somewhere along the line, I bought her a really big statue. Like it should have gone in the garden, was one of
Uh-huh.
those, but she refused to put it in the garden because this was Saint Teresa. So it had a place in the house. And when she moved to the assisted living, Saint Teresa had to come with us.
Okay.
And she was blind. So well, where's Saint Teresa? Well, Saint Teresa is in this little corner facing you on the bed, facing
Okay.
the bed, right?
Uh-huh.
And when she passed, I went, what am I going to do with this stupid statue? Right?
Right. Yeah.
Oh my God. So I thought, well, let me bring it home. Well, I found a place in my home, and now I don't ever want to let it go.
Hmm.
It's like this tangible piece of her
Yeah.
that I love. And I never thought, it never occurred to me that it would become so important to me.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
I think sometimes we need to be open to things after someone goes in a
Hmm.
way that I hadn't expected to be open.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah.
St.
Everything
Teresa,
changes.
yeah, St. Teresa's guarding my front door, and I
There you
never
go.
expected that to happen. It's amazing. It really is. So
So, what
um,
would you say was most surprising about caregiving in general?
I still go back to how it changes every relationship in your life. It's everything is affected,
Hmm.
and that I love the fact that my mom and I struggled when I was growing up, but through these last 8 years, we really became a team
Mm.
in a way I never expected that we could. And so that caregiving was an incredible gift for me in terms of my mom and being able to love her in new and different ways. She's so funny. My dad was more affectionate, but my mom was not. It was the way she was brought up, right?
Yeah.
Really strict Italian parents. And so she had a hard time growing up saying, I love you.
Mm.
But as time went on in caregiving, she told me more and more, I
Mm.
love you. Thank you for taking care of me, which was like, wow, that's my mom in a different way. And after
Yeah.
she passed, I got some incredible notes from her friends saying she was so proud of you. She
Yes.
loved you so much. So she was funny because she could talk to other
Other
people about me, but
people.
she couldn't
Yes.
say it to me.
Yeah.
There is great healing in that with her
Mhm.
passing. Great
Yeah.
healing in that. But yeah, how it changes. And now on the other side of it, how much it's changed me
Mm.
in ways I never would have expected. Yeah, it's really life changing. I think sometimes
Mhm.
it could be for better or for worse. And I'm just
Mhm.
grateful through the grace of God, it was for better.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how would you say God showed up for you in your caregiving?
God very much showed up for me in caregiving by helping me to become self aware and helping me to realize that I had a choice that caregiving could make or break the relationship with my mother.
Mm.
And I had a choice. And that choice was to become more self aware and put aside that inner 8-year-old and any past hurts and really be open and honest with her in dialogue in ways I hadn't been before. One example comes to me, when I went up to be her caregiver for those 4 days, I would walk in the door and I would get bombarded with all the things she needed done or whatever and whatever, whatever. And my head was spinning because I just had to pack up my life and drive an hour to get to her. And I knew there was a lot on my plate. And so the self-awareness to say, okay, you need to take a step back and say, Mom, it would really help me if when I walk in the door, I can go to the bathroom, put my stuff down, get a glass of water, and come sit with you and talk. Like, I just need 15 minutes. And that 8-year-old child would have said, would you just leave me alone and do what I need to do? So I really feel like God was guiding me to how to understand my mother better,
Mhm.
and in the understanding of her, change my behaviors, because the only behaviors you can change is yours.
Yes, 100%.
Now, my mother did change. She absolutely grew and changed. And watching that
Mhm.
happen was a gift,
Yeah.
an absolute gift. I think about that last month of her life. We had 2 baby showers. The first one, we saw people we hadn't seen since the pandemic. And I have some of the best pictures of my mom, just people sitting down and hugging her and sitting down and
Mm.
talking with her.
Mhm.
And then the second baby shower was my 65th birthday. And so we got to spend my birthday together. The family sang happy birthday loudly and off key, which was very fun. And that was a Sunday. And then that Thursday was Thanksgiving. Mom and I hosted Thanksgiving at her assisted living in the private dining room with people who didn't have family.
Mm.
And my mother was always the host.
Yeah.
And what that did was bring her back to her. And I would be in the
Yes.
kitchen area and hear her and hear them talking, and getting to know one another better. And 3 of the 4 were Italians. They were talking
Oh my
about growing
gosh.
up Italian, right? And so that was Thursday. Saturday, I did a food demo because I would do a food demo once a month. I still do that. And Monday, she was gone
Mm.
completely unexpectedly. And I just feel like she kind of said, okay, God, this
Mhm.
was really wonderful. I'm ready to meet Dawn again.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And that was such a gift.
Mhm.
And God, completely God's handiwork. I had
Mm.
nothing to do with that. She wasn't sick. She was in the
Right.
hospital. We were shocked.
Yeah.
We were shocked.
I'm
Yeah.
sure it was really hard to hear that news, like just like to even imagine that it was true, but at the same time, what a blessing.
100%. I'm like,
Yeah.
what? What? And yet, Rayna, I look back and I think, these last couple of weeks, she was sleeping a lot more.
So you were seeing those things. Yeah.
Yeah, and I remember one time thinking, I wonder if she's starting to transition. Because
Mm.
when you've gone through this already, you see that.
Hmm.
But by the same token, you and I know a transition could be a week or
Oh,
years.
yeah. Hmm.
So may I share something my brother texted to me?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. So this came as a text to me about 3 days after the services. He said, I had a very strange dream last night. He did a eulogy Friday night. I was giving that eulogy again, and then in the dream, I had a moment where something came to me like a realization. Well, in this dream, I realized that Thanksgiving dinner was very important because it's when she became Doris again, inviting everyone that needed it to come to the dinner table, a major theme on Friday and Saturday, like old times. I think God needed to see that her soul had been restored and that now and only now she was ready to join Daddy. Oh, and make no mistake about it, he carried her over the threshold of heaven. I woke up weeping.
Mm. So beautiful.
And there was God
Hmm.
in that whole thing, And so I'm so grateful for the experience and blessed at the way she went. It was what she wanted. She for
Hmm.
8 years, she wanted to meet up with my dad again,
Yeah.
So yeah, yeah, it's what we all want for the people we love,
Hmm.
we really, and for ourselves. So God was all over it. Sometimes you don't see it.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's hard to see it in the middle of it. And that's part of the reason why I love to ask that question, because on the outside we can see it, but sometimes in the middle of it, it can be hard. But when we learn to see him in the middle of it too, then it's that much more of a blessing, because I think that's where the joy is when we start to see that he is right there in the middle of it all. And when we start to call it out to ourselves, it's just, there's a joy there that isn't there when we don't notice.
Well, truly, because in the midst of all that, without God working it would have been 100% different.
Mm-hmm.
100% different. One of the things that's really has also been a blessing for a lot of reasons, I stopped going to my church. Between caregiving and the church was changing and all that good stuff. And I recently found a new church that feels like home, and it's so wonderful to go back to that.
Mm-hmm.
I hadn't, in the midst of the craziness of caregiving and trying to do it over Zoom and stuff like that. It wasn't the same when you're in prayer together and when you're in song together. There, as the song goes, God is in our midst.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it's really been wonderful to have that part of my life back. It really has been. So, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So let's close with just a nugget of wisdom you would like to pass on to our listeners.
A nugget of wisdom. Oh, golly. I think my nugget is just know that there is grief throughout this entire process. And that sometimes to just say, if you are sharp or angry or frustrated and it comes out in a behavior on you, I want you to take a step moment, say it back, and maybe pray about it a little bit and think, is this something that the person did that it's okay to be angry about? Or is this kind of this knee-jerk reaction because they've just not been able to dress themselves, and you're realizing at some level how that's another thing they can no longer do.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really grief underlying that they're slowly going away from you. Because if you can recognize the grief and you can feel it and move on, you tend to not have the craziness in terms of the behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
And when you recognize the grief, give yourself grace.
Such great words. So, Deb, how can our audience connect with you and just keep up with all the things you're doing?
Absolutely. So you mentioned at the beginning my website, which is www.advocateformomanddad.com. And I've been writing a lot about this season now that I'm in, the season after caregiving. And I will say it's so wonderful to hear as a writer, if you can voice what someone else is feeling and they recognize it, it's such a blessing. It really is. And particularly this last article about the fight, flight, or freeze, I've had a lot of people say, well, this is what I'm going through. Thank you. I can now forgive myself. I don't have to beat myself up that I'm still feeling this way, however long after, the passing or the caregiving has ended. And then there are the 2 books that you mentioned, and they're available on Amazon. If you Google my name, the first name is Debra, Debra, and the last name Hallisey, Hallisey, they'll come up and you can order them. And I hope you find them helpful.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Deb, for being here and just sharing a little of your journey with your parents and the season outside of it. I think this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for having me. I love chatting with you. I really do.
Thank you again for joining us on a Season of Caring podcast for Stories of Hope with Deb. We're thankful for the opportunity to share with you a little about our grief process. If you're interested in learning more about finding peace in grief, visit aseasonofcaring.com looking for Peace in Grief, a resource for brokenhearted caregivers. Filled with opportunities for you to learn more about different kinds of grief, sit in on grief conversations, as well as learn more about how to process your grief. A Season of Caring podcast has been created for sharing stories of hope for living content, loving well, and caring with no regrets. If you have financial, legal, or medical questions, be sure to consult your local professionals and take heart in your season of caring.